Okay, no mai, here mai, tenekoto katoa, na mihi nui ki katoa. Warm greetings, everyone who is joining us, not only here in New Zealand, but across the globe. It is a pleasure to welcome you to our lecture of Emily White as part of our Thinkers and Doers lecture series. For those that don't know me, my name is Bruno Marquez, and I am the program director for the landscape architecture degree at Victoria University of Wellington. So the Thinkers and Doers lecture series aims at bringing together practitioners, academics, and students that are interested in a topic and the discipline of landscape architecture in order to share ideas and to hear the best and the latest innovations in the field. So this initiative is between the New Zealand Institute of Landscape Architects, our Wellington branch, and Victoria University of Wellington. Our eighth speaker, Emily White, is a landscape architect practicing in Sweden. She is a partner at the office of Landskapslaget, sorry Emily if I mispronounced it, in Stockholm, working with landscape architecture, landscape and urban planning. And since 2010, she is the co-author of several guidelines connected to planning of landscapes in public open space. She has an international outlook through engagements at the International Federation of Landscape Architects, and she's also teaching at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, SLU. Her lecture is titled Integrated Landscape Character Assessment, a Toolkit for Long-Term Spatial Planning, and looks at sustainable transport systems and the considerable impact on the landscape as a result of the building and management of roads and railways. Therefore, a holistic approach to resources, values, and change processes of the landscape has become an increasingly important issue. Understanding the landscape as an arena is an important basis and starting point for both long-term strategic planning and in continuous spatial planning. So drawing from her Swedish experience over the last years, this lecture will discuss an interdisciplinary methodology by providing a toolkit to obtain a holistic understanding of the dynamics of the landscape. Such toolkit has been widely implemented in Sweden, especially in high-speed railway systems. And Emily will be describing the methods that can be used in long-term planning. Just some very briefly housekeeping rules. Don't forget that Emily will be sharing her screen, so don't forget to keep this window open so you can actually see the slides. Also, please remain muted throughout the talk, just to minimize any background noise. And at the end, there will be an opportunity for questions. You can either ask them verbally or you can write them in the chat box. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Emily all the way from Sweden.
Thank you very much. Okay, so Bruno, what I'd like to do is to share my screen, but I wonder, I'm not that accustomed to Zoom. Are you seeing me now? Or
we are seeing you at the moment.
Yes, good. Okay, so here I am. I'm Emily. I'm calling you from Stockholm, which is sort of on the other side of the world from Wellington, which is very nice. So that means I've just said goodnight to my children, and it's a bit later than usual that I spend time at the computer, actually. But it's very, very nice that you invited me. I appreciate this very much. And I've also been very curious at this series this initiative of Thinkers and Doers, which is really made available also to a lot of people who are aware of that this is happening. So I thought I'd start off by sharing my other screen to introduce you to the topic that I will discuss today. Yes. So let me just confirm that you are seeing my screen.
Yeah, it's working perfectly well.
Good. And are you also seeing a bar with different faces on the right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Should I move that some way?
No, that's fine. Just keep it like that.
Okay. I'll just, this is just kind of starting up, the starting up part. Good. Okay. So I was invited here to talk to you about something that I've engaged myself in for some years now, a method called integrated landscape character assessment. And to start off, I thought just to fill in some of the details that Bruno started with, this is my office. Well, one day at the office. We don't always work like this, but we are an office of landscape architects and urban planners that have really started to take initiatives to make things happen in the public space where we are. So there are 40 employees, and there's a lot of engagement from the different specialities within the office that leads to this kind of happy interaction with other local people in the city. So this is just to show that the vicinity of my office, really. I thought I might start off by introducing a bit of where I'm coming from. I think in a way it's fascinating because Scandinavia, which includes Sweden, has a lot of similarities to New Zealand. If you talk about Sweden, this is kind of a very wide, broad image of what we do in Sweden. As you see on the right, a lot of Sweden is covered with forests. It's 69%. So you can imagine that the forest industry is also a very important part of Sweden's economy. 8% consists of arable land, which is also very concentrated to the southern parts of Sweden. So most of these 69% of forest appear in the north, and the 8% appear in the south. And only 3% of the whole area of Sweden is considered to be areas which are settled with urban areas. And where I come from, where I live, here in the Stockholm area, I guess we have a climate which is a cousin of the southern island of New Zealand. We also have a temperate broadleaf forest, yet we don't have any rainforests where I am. And the pine trees have kind of been, they're more mixed with other forests as well. We have a bedrock which is extremely old. So the image you see here is, you could say, New Zealand in a few billion years' time. It's all worn down. It's cracked. It's shaped by really the turns of the time. So this means that the structure of the landscape has a lot of layers. It has big structures like faults. It has big structures coming from the Ice Age, like eskers. Yes, you know what eskers are. The whole country is kind of draped with moraine, and in the arable areas there's clay and sand. And the city of Stockholm, of course, as every city, has been placed in a very strategic location. This was where two big water bodies met. It was the Baltic Sea, which is connected to, sorry, there's a bit of night flying animals here. It was connected to, well, you know, Russia, Finland, Poland, Germany. And on the other side, we have the Great Lake of Mälaren. So this means it's a very interesting spot where a lot of things happens, and there's a mosaic of all these different nature types of water, forest, arable land. And this means that it's been inhabited and the center of power for about 1,000 years. Now, this time, as we're speaking, this is the most densely populated area in Sweden, and it's not in the middle of Sweden. It's a bit up on the go. What I thought I would introduce you to today is a project which was initiated by the Swedish Transport Administration. Someone at this administration quoted this: "The Swedish Transport Administration is creating the largest landscape transformation since the Ice Age." Okay, so then you understand the scope of this organization, or maybe it's the image of its own role and persona. And to just get this into kind of monetary terms, I thought I'd translate it to something which could be called National Investment Plan in Roads and Rail. We have a 10-year plan which is decided by the Parliament, and the last one that was decided added up to well, it's 622 billion Swedish crowns, which it's about the equivalent of 110 billion New Zealand dollars, or 66 billion euros. So at least in Swedish terms, this is a lot of money, really a lot of money. And at the same time, we have these huge challenges that are coming on, that we realize that we need to prepare for climate change. We don't need to prepare, we are preparing, we're doing it right now. And we have a desperate need to strengthen biodiversity. So you have this incredible development where there's a lot of urbanization, a lot of need to build new infrastructure. And at the same time, we're finding ourselves understanding we need to make way for the resilience of the changing landscape. So the Transport Administration, they presented this plan of 66 billion euro, and the government gave them homework. They said, okay, very good, we appreciate all these investments, but how are you affecting the environment? How are you affecting the landscape? And they said, we can't see a proper demonstration of this. And so the Transport Administration, they decided that, okay, maybe it's because we're doing it the wrong way. Maybe we're asking the wrong questions. And I thought I'd show you this image because today in Sweden, a lot of planning goes on in the left, the corner in the left down here. We have within the national spatial planning, which also includes planning for road and rail, we have very specialist planning. We have planning for natural recreation areas, we have planning for infrastructure, for energy, for biodiversity, for cultural heritage. It's all kind of specialized. And I think this picture actually is not just unique for Sweden, but we've achieved a great specialization within a lot of developed countries. So when we apply a new measure, like a new high-speed railway or a road, our legislation is focused on avoiding too much damage, avoiding to mitigate or to not sort of create too much problems for each of these sectors. So this is a problem in itself, that you're starting with a negative starting point, that you're going to inflict damage, and that it's very diverse and divided sectors. So one of the kind of main aims in this project that I participated in was to change this perspective from not damaging, but to see, is there potential to instead have a sustainable development? Could we plan in a different way? Could we interact in a different way? Could we collaborate to find new solutions? And this went also very well with the European Landscape Convention, which is a convention that we've ratified in Sweden. We have many countries in Europe which lives by the European Landscape Convention. If we look at the planning outcome or the planning situation without the ELC, the European Landscape Convention, it's a lot about this. If we see this base plate as the landscape and we have a measure, we already know there are some areas which may be designated, for example, which have been described, valued within these different sectors. So when there's a lot of different new investments being made, like maintenance, new investments, trimming, blah, 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 if we only look at if these affect the areas which are already designated, we will only get a certain type of answer. So in this change of perspective, we need to build an understanding that will give us answers between the designated areas. So we need a holistic understanding of the landscape, and that means that we need to work more interdisciplinary to find what is the landscape, what does it consist of. And the kind of challenge in this, of course, is that if you look at a timeline where we in Sweden have strategic planning, preliminary studies, you evaluate, and then eventually you land in construction and design. It's at the stage of the strategic planning, you often know very little of the landscape, but in fact, your ability or possibility to influence what's going to happen is actually the greatest. So we have a process here which is actually working in two different directions. So one of the aims of this, the project or the method that I will also get back to in a little while here, is to try and expand this knowledge about the landscape early in the planning, early in the spatial planning. So when the next investment plan of X million crowns comes, it's laid at the table, we can at least say something about what implications they will have about the landscape. But that means we also need to find knowledge about the landscape earlier on in the process. So there was this identified need to find a method that could help us find this kind of knowledge on a very large scale context, very early in the planning, strategic planning, and still have a holistic approach. So I guess most of you who are listening to this talk today, you are probably well acquainted with landscape. But when I have lectures both for my students, but also for professionals within the transport administrations that are not landscape architects, I usually start off by just briefly talking about what the landscape is. And I think this image that's been produced by Val Kirby from Natural England gives a very good kind of overview. That if we want to talk about landscape, we need to know different things about the landscape. We need to know about the landscape form. We need to know about the ecosystem that goes on the surface. We need to know about the land use. We need to know about the time depth. And we also need to acknowledge the experience or relationship that people has to the landscape. And all of this, of course, goes very well with the European Landscape Convention. So the European Landscape Convention, it states that man is a part of the landscape and the landscape is part of man. that man creates his history in landscape, and landscape, its history, shapes man. So basically, it's a very democratic convention. It means that we're all responsible, but we all have the right to influence our common environment. But even if this is the convention, we take the landscape for granted, and we don't acknowledge all these different aspects of what a landscape is and that it belongs to everyone. And when we then plan infrastructure, it often ends up like this. And it doesn't have to look like this. This is not making anyone happy, besides maybe the railway people who work with maintenance at this specific stretch. So if we are taking the landscape for granted and not acknowledging all the layers and all the knowledge that we need, it just ends up like this. And eventually we will have a landscape which is very ugly, very fragmented. All kinds of bad things are going to happen. So this image is kind of showing you the vision of this integrated landscape assessment method. You could say that it consists of different building blocks that by putting these building blocks together, you acquire this knowledge that you need to be able to make wise decisions on how the landscape is affected. So if I very sort of briefly tell you what this means, it's that we need to describe the landscape as a whole. And a good method of doing that is to use the landscape character assessment as a method. So the landscape character assessment, it talks about areas like this, and areas that have a lot of similarities and a lot of similar history, similar landform, and so on. So we need a character description, a description that can be communicated and to have the aim to create an arena, you could say, arena for speaking, because these lines, these borders in a landscape character assessment, they're not made because the area is particularly valuable, or it's not a legal border. It's just a descriptive border. It gives us an opportunity to say, okay, what goes on within this area has these qualities or these functions. So that's kind of the core of this method, to use the landscape character assessment as a way to be able to communicate about the landscape. But then there are some other very important things that interacts with the landscape character description, and that is that we need deeper understanding for the different aspects of the landscape. As I said, there is a very kind of specialized knowledge and information about the landscape in Sweden, and to assess rather to approach these different specialized bodies, they could be authorities, we need to have understood and describe, say, the historical time depth. We need to be solid in our knowledge of what the landscape's historical context is. We also need to be very well acquainted with the form of the landscape, its geomorphological development, its scale, its visual appearance, all the things that landscape architects usually are the professionals of, you could say. And we really need an understanding about the landscape ecology, because the ecology it was there first, you could say, and especially with infrastructure, we're always affecting systems, because infrastructure is a system and ecology is also always a system, you could say. And now I'm talking about the structures and the connections, which are not just specific nature types, but habitats and networks which work together. So the thematic studies, the character description, and something that I'll get back to, pitching in it a little and observing what are the development trends. Can we see sensitivity and potential in these landscapes? Because if you say, for example, the forests, I mentioned there was a lot of forests in Sweden. Because of a lot of decisions that's been made over the last 50 years, we have very few biological, very little biodiversity in our forests. And you could talk about a destroyed landscape, and it's a fragmented landscape. It's a landscape that's been altered through drainage and through the use of how we plant and stuff. So already in this landscape, we have a sensitivity for things that could put an extra strain on the landscape. But in that specific landscape, we also have a potential to perhaps help some of the damage we've done before, and while we're investing in infrastructure. So in introducing these sensitivity and potential is to put the finger on structures and characters that may be on the border of breaking down, and how we could avoid that. And the potential is about how we could strengthen those aspects of the landscape which may actually could be improved in some way. So if we simplify it, the landscape character assessment is focused on asking these 4 questions. What does the landscape look like and why? What's going on in the landscape? What are the development trends? What is the ongoing processes? What are the sensitivities concerning, for example, this with the fragmented forests? And is there a potential to enhance, to restore, or create values and functions in the landscapes, which makes it more resilient in the future? So this set of questions is kind of the objective and the guideline to make a the integrated landscape character assessment. So one example is just to show you that the scale can be very big. Is we did an integrated landscape character assessment of southern Sweden. So this is about 100,000 square kilometers. I don't know if you, it's difficult just to say a number, but anyway, here in the south of Sweden, Stockholm is up beyond this map. There's a city of Gothenburg here, for those of you who may be acquainted with Sweden. And in the south, we have several towns where Malmö, Copenhagen on the other side, Denmark is the closest. So through making this, following this method, we could characterize the whole of this area to prepare it for pulling or planning the high-speed railway. And something that's interesting to observe in this picture is that if you want to characterize, we often find that the number of landscape character types, which contains character areas which are specific, they are often similar whether you're working on a huge scale or a small scale. So in this case, we found that there were 8 landscape character types. These are the ones on the left. And that means they're kind of very typical, very clear landscape types. So if I just translate, the first is like the Great Plains, the plain landscape. The second is the mosaic landscape. The third is the esker landscape, because it's characterized by a lot of structures, which are these eskers, and so on. So, and within each of these landscape character types, you will find specific, unique character areas. So if you look at the yellow ones, for example, down here at the bottom of the map, they are all part of the plains landscape, but there are different character areas. So even on this very big scale, you're very early planning, very strategic planning, you are able to kind of start somewhere and actually find a way to characterize an area. So what we wanted to do within the characterization was to put a very easy way to communicate these different characters, even if this is just like a simplified version of it. But just to show you, we want to make sure we know about the content, the physical features, the context, what's going on, what are the functional networks, for example, the spatial context, and what are the ongoing processes, both the natural and the man-made. So all of these things should be included. And by working with images like these two, for example, this is in Swedish, but what it says is different kind of elements, like the relative heights in this area is an important part of the character. It's close to the big cities, so the green wedges are actually used for urban recreation, for example. Whilst in this area, for example, this is a very rationalized plains landscape where because of the farming, gradually produced problems in this landscape. We have almost no water left. The small islands of biodiversity are very scarce. There's a social problem because the farms are kind of scattered. So we have like a depth, almost, you could say. So in this type of landscape, we have a potential which differs from this type of landscape, and the characters can also be very clearly described. And to do this in a systematic way, we always use a kind of checklist while we are out in the field. And even in this scale that I showed you in the south of Sweden, we do field trips. It's a very, very important part of the method that when you've done your field studies and observed kind of the different aspects you could look at, you always need to go out in the field. And with an area like this, of course, and with a budget, you don't have budget and time that ends forever. You need to be sort of clear what you're doing. So we usually put the whole gang in a minibus, and then we're driving for 2 to 3 days in an area, observing with the help of these checklists about the landscape character and what we're seeing, because you really need to see, like development trends, we need to see in our eyes what are the ongoing processes. And we can, of course, have a lot of this information from also local governments and people living in the area. But it's very important to see for yourself. So in this minibus, that's kind of where the integration starts. We need to have different fields of work. We need to have people who work with ecology, cultural heritage, planning, landscape architecture, and so on, maybe geology or hydrology. And we always collect people from usually it's a client, but you can, of course, if you have a government structure with these different skills, you don't have to use a consultant, but we always work very closely with a client, say a local government, who is an expert in their area from these different sectors. So together we travel and we observe the characters and what the landscape consists of. I mentioned we need the thematic studies, and to make the method relatively repeatable and not too complex, we've decided on 3 different thematic studies. Now these thematic studies can be expanded and they can include more things than we've described in a publication I'll show you later. But a few examples then is the thematic study of the landscape form. That includes base things like what geology do we have? Very important is the spatial context. What are the relative heights? Are there very clear directions in the landscape? What is the scale of these spatial areas and stuff? So in the left picture here, you can see a kind of regional assessment of the sizes of open spaces. And now I'm not going to be able to sort of ask you questions while I'm doing this talk, but I'll tell you instead that if you look at the top, you can see these blobs. They're quite big, whilst if you go further down, they are very small. So just by looking at this, you will see that in the north, we have a very large scale plain structure, whilst just south of that, we have a very small scale mosaic structure. And the really big shape going up and down, that's a huge lake. So the landscape form is an important part of the theme study. The landscape ecology is extremely important. It's important because if you just use the already available assessments that you can find from your municipality or local government, they will often only be made either in a place where there's been a development, say someone wants to build something and we make an assessment of this little area, or it's a designated area that's been protected in some way. But to get a good picture of the landscape, how it works, its systems with for larger animals, or how the water works, we need a different type of analysis that goes beyond borders, beyond designated areas. And in the landscape ecology, we can find a lot of very interesting connections that need to be observed while planning these large-scale structures. In the historical time depth, it's also possible to make an enormous amount of very interesting assessments. And in the historical depth theme, we often try to give a rich description of the reasons why the landscape looks the way it does, and what decisions that was made historically that has produced the landscape today. And quite often, with the knowledge of the landscape's form, say if you have an esker, you have a river that meets a lake, for example, you have a very strategic spot. That strategic spot is probably as interesting and a hotspot in the future as well. So settlements and interests in the landscape that have been going on for a long time often shows that it will be going on for a long time in the future as well. Yes, okay. So I'm just going to move you about a little so I can see. So I mentioned this was an interdisciplinary method. Still, we need to address the specialized knowledge of these different sectors that are very established, at least in our planning system. So what we've done is we've tried to work with the terminology that we usually work with in environmental impact assessments. This is an example of those kind of things, where the green, if you see the yellow image here, the green text comes from the ecology, the red text comes from the cultural side, the blue text comes from planning and social sustainability side. So when we are describing the character of the landscape, or the functions in the landscape, or the relationship or relation to the landscape you can have, we always sort of include all these different aspects. I I think these effects or aspects is a very important way to make the right persons listen. When we talk about the sensitivity of the character or the function in the landscape or the potential, we need to use a vocabulary that is established already within the legislation. So to kind of conclude what we've been achieving with this method, well, let me tell you first. The actual development of the method went on for about 5 years, and during that time there was a lot of case studies of rail, of road, of small scale, of large scale projects, and finally it kind of landed in this methodology called integrated landscape character assessment. Now this method is asked for from the Transport Administration in tenders. So if as a consultant you are supplying your services to the Transport Administration, they will ask for a landscape analysis which has been done in the ILCA, or the Integrated Landscape Character Assessment method, which means you have a much more deeper understanding even in the projects, even if this was actually first sort of for the really large scale kind of national regional planning. It's now also used in specific projects. So I think what the Transport Administration has found is that so far this is the best we have of finding a comprehensive knowledge of the past, the landscape, both past, present and future. So it gives us really a good tool to know about the landscape. We can suddenly start to talk about the landscape in a way which is not just guesses, but it's really very well grounded. It's also a tool that really can incorporate public participation, because one example is when we characterize an area, we make an expert characterization. We make a line and we describe a character which we think are suitable. But then when you meet the people who live in this area, they may have other kinds of information like, oh no, that's connected to this and this history of this is whatever. So when we have this public interaction, we often change the character borders or complement the description of the theme studies. And we've found that in a development project such as a new road, if you start your conversation with the affected public by start to talk about the landscape's assets, the landscape's functions and characters, you're on completely different speaking terms than if you start by saying, okay, we're going to build a new road here. So if you start with the landscape perspective, we also find it is going to influence this new road in a completely different and more participatory way, I think, than the traditional way of planning a road. So also with this method, because we've identified the sensitivity and potential in these different landscape character areas, we really have a potential to strengthen landscape qualities as well, because these 622 billion Swedish crowns, they are a huge investment. And why not make use of also giving an extra, making an enhancement to the landscape that can make it function better and not produce as many bad side effects as it's usually been done. So I don't know, Bruno, if this lecture will be available afterwards, but I thought if you'd be interested, I've added some links and I've tried to add links which are sort of English because I appreciate that not a lot of people know Swedish. But the good thing actually is you see there's an image here next to the central text, and that's an English description of the method that we also use in the education for students of landscape architecture. So if you're sort of interested to know a bit more about the method, it's described in this landscape as an arena. Yes, okay, well, thank you. I think I'll stop there and let you, if you have any questions or if you didn't understand or, yeah.
Well, thank you, Emily, for that. It was very, very interesting. Love the holistic approach to the entire assessment of the landscape. Not seeing it as something that is quantifiable, that we need to characterize and map and not do anything with that afterwards. Okay, so now it's time for questions. So you can either ask your question directly to Emily, and don't forget to unmute yourself, or you can type your question in the chat box and we will read it to Emily. I can see there's someone ready to go, Sophie.
Oh, okay, yeah. Hi, kia ora, Bruno, and kia ora, Emily. It's really lovely to hear you describe this. I'm finishing a PhD between Copenhagen University and Victoria in Wellington, so I'm very familiar with this idea of the character assessment, but you described it really excellently. Thank you. I'm curious, I guess, to know whether you investigation into whether you can start to integrate this with Indigenous worldviews as well, because for us in New Zealand, that's as a settler nation, we're being asked to consider primarily the knowledge of our Indigenous peoples, and we're beginning to make connections between our Western way of thinking about landscape with Maori ones. But I'm interested to know if perhaps you've done any with the Sami people or any other people around Sweden.
I can't say we have experience from doing that. In fact, I'd say that the part which is participatory and aims to identify the local relation to the landscape has not been as developed as the more kind of the usual disciplinary approach. So I'd say that there's been what do you say, ambition to really make sure that this is included in the projects, but I'm ashamed to say that it hasn't been so far. But I say also that we have one project which I only mentioned called this new high-speed railways in Sweden, and this is a gigantic project. It's really it's a huge project, and in the case of a big project like that, there's been a different type of ambition, and in the goals for that project, there is also aims to include truly people's views or knowledge, you could say, about the landscape. But that is in the southern of Sweden, so it's actually not it's not affecting the traditional Sami regions, which is a bit north of Stockholm and further north. So no, I'm sorry, I can't say, but I'd say that the ambition and the possibility to do this is very, very good if you use the method. Yeah.
Sophie, I'm not sure if you asked something else, but you are muted.
No, all good.
Okay. Any other questions from our audience? All right, while we give some time to people. Emma.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Bruno.
Hi, Emma.
You can hear me?
Yeah, loud and
That's
clear.
Good. I was just wondering if Emily had any examples of projects in the roading sector where they'd use that and how it might have influenced the design.
My examples are projects which are still quite early in the planning process, because this is a method that was really kind of published in 2015. So it's been about 5 years since it's been established. And I have several Swedish reports. Nothing that, let me just think. If I go to your question, if it's influenced the design, I could say yes, it has. In a few examples, we applied the method on a project which was a new motorway through a region of Sweden called Västra Götaland. It's just north of Gothenburg, and there we included the knowledge of these deficiencies that have been going on in the landscape, like changing the water structures, and also we had a very participatory interaction with the people who lived in this area. So, for example, when we tried to evaluate different alternatives, because our task was to find different alternatives of a road, we found that through this participation and through the deficiencies or sensitivities we identified, the road was located in a different route and was kind of combined in a way which might not actually have been the most economical way, but in the short term. But in the long term, it gave us great possibilities to actually make sure that the landscape and the people could continue to develop. So that's one example. Yeah. Another example is one I'm working with right now in the north of Sweden, which is a new railway connecting two coastal towns, well, several coastal towns. One is called Umeå and one is called Luleå. So this is the Bay of Bothnia, which is right at the top where Finland and Sweden meets. And this is really an area with a lot of Sami people, which has experienced a fragmentation of their reindeer land because of infrastructure. And there's been quite of, I would say ignorance, but not, the transport administration hasn't listened very well to them earlier. But through this project, we've been able to, what do you say, when you locate something together. So instead of putting the railway in other locations because of the industry, we've decided to really fight very hard to integrate it with the existing structure, meaning that we have now been able to build, or we are going to build, two very, very big fauna passages, which are going to also change the barrier effect of the existing structure. So this will really give a kind of, and that's because we've identified that these systems and structures, they're very wide. They're not just the very little area we're looking at. They're huge. So through this analysis, we've been able to identify that these things are going on, and we need to accommodate the problem and have a budget for it. So maybe that's an example as well.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Emma, for your question. Emily, there is 2 questions in a chat box from Danka. At what level of planning, strategic, regional, or local, have you been using this methodology, and at what level does it have the most impact on the future infrastructure location?
I'd say that it's had mostly been used at the local and regional level. We've used it in many projects, which is really the local level, like these two I mentioned now. We are waiting for a kind of a decision at the transport administrations to make this kind of ILCAs all over Sweden for the regions. But that decision has not been taken. So only some regions have produced these kind of ILCAs, and sometimes the driver has been the transport administration, but sometimes the driver has actually been the local authority, no, not local, what do you say, regional governmental authority. So we've made several of these ILCAs for regions, and that does not only include infrastructure, that also includes all types of planning. So I think right now I'd say it had most impact on infrastructure location, because now, as I mentioned, the transport administration is asking the consultants to produce this kind of analysis in every big project. So that's really a very efficient way of getting it done. Yeah, so maybe that's an answer there.
Yeah, and I think it kind of leads to the next question as well.
Yeah.
How strict is the planning legislation in Sweden? For example, if an infrastructure is planned by the regional level spatial land use plan, is there room to move it when working at the local level?
Yeah, I'd say that our regional planning is not very strong. We don't, if you compare our planning system to, say, France, for example, it's very different. In France, they have a regional level, which is binding, as I've understood it anyway, a kind of a binding guideline, not even guideline, it's a binding, what do you call it? Structure for how to proceed, and the municipalities needs to really always sort of relate to this planning. In Sweden, the regional planning is emerging, you could say, but it's not very strong in our legislation. But there is a problem in a way, because we have very strong planning initiative within the municipality, the local level, and very strong initiative within the transport administration. So we have different legislations for planning of roads and rail, for example. The intention when the transport administration decided to develop this method was that you would get a good start at the regional level in the spatial plan, kind of, that would be then applied on the local level. But it's not perfect. No.
Okay, Emily, I think we're probably going to stay here because it's getting too late for you.
Yeah. Well, no, not for me, but you need to get to work and everything.
I think on behalf of Victoria University and New Zealand Institute of Landscape Architects, I'd like to thank you for sharing your work and your experience with us. I think it's a very interesting topic at the moment, especially in New Zealand, when we're thinking about changing our planning tools at this stage. And it's always nice to hear, what our twin brothers are doing in Scandinavia. And also, of course, it's very nice to see you and to hear you, as always. Well, thank you so much for staying up until late and sharing the knowledge with us. I'm sure that it's going to, make us think deeply for the rest of the day here in New Zealand. I'd like to thank everyone that also joined us. I'm sure from across the many corners of the world. And everyone have a great day or a great evening, wherever you are based. And Emily, thank you so much. I hope to talk to you soon again.
Thank you very much. Okay, have a
Take care.
good day.
Bye-bye.